When he first retired, the days stretched endlessly before him like an empty road with no clear destination. For decades, he had been an engineer, solving problems with precision, guiding projects from blueprints into reality. His life had been measured in deadlines and designs, in the steady rhythm of work and responsibility. But once he stepped away, the silence of his home seemed louder than the hum of any machine he had ever worked beside. He would sit by the window some mornings, watching children rush off to school, and wonder quietly if the world had already moved on without him. He felt himself drifting, as though the world had little use for someone whose hands no longer built and whose mind no longer shaped the future. His neighbors knew him only as the quiet old man at the end of the street. Conversations were brief, polite greetings exchanged while bringing in the mail. What gnawed at him was not just loneliness, but the thought of becoming invisible, of reaching the end of his life with nothing more than memories that would fade when he did. One afternoon, while trimming his small garden, he noticed the boy from next door, sitting on the curb, shoulders slumped under the weight of his school bag. The boy looked troubled, staring down at his shoes, as though they held answers he could not find. He hesitated before approaching, unsure if a child would even want to speak to him. But something in the boy's posture, a mix of frustration and defeat, pulled him forward. The boy admitted he was failing math, the numbers never making sense no matter how hard he tried. His parents worked long hours and had little time to help, and the fear of repeating a grade loomed over him like a shadow. In that moment, the retired engineer felt an old spark stir inside him, the same one that had once guided him through complicated formulas and designs. Without thinking too much, he offered to help. The boy agreed, reluctantly at first, unsure of what this quiet old man could do. That evening, they sat together at the kitchen table, pencils scratching against paper, numbers dancing across the page. The engineer explained patiently, not just with rules, but with stories, comparing equations to bridges, circuits, and puzzles. For the first time, the boy's eyes lit up with curiosity instead of dread. It was small, but the change was real. Walking back to his empty living room that night, the retired man felt a shift. For the first time since leaving his career, he sensed that his years of knowledge had not been wasted. They were waiting, quietly, for someone to receive them, and perhaps, in teaching one boy, he had found a reason to begin again. The following weeks unfolded with a quiet rhythm, as the boy returned each evening with books and questions. What had once been an empty house now carried the sound of pencils scratching, the low murmur of explanations, and sometimes even laughter when a mistake turned into a lesson. The retired engineer, who had once feared the silence of his days, now found himself looking forward to the knock at his door. At first, it was not easy. The boy often grew restless, his young mind distracted by the world outside the window. There were times when frustration bubbled over, when numbers blurred and answers seemed impossibly far away. The retired man would pause, breathe, and search for another way to explain. Instead of scolding, he spoke with patience, drawing bridges out of lines, turning equations into the paths of rockets, and describing formulas as the secret languages of invention. Slowly, the boy began to see not just math, but possibility. Word spread in the neighborhood. Another child came, shy and hesitant, then another. Before long, the kitchen table was no longer enough, and he moved lessons to the porch, where the evening breeze carried the sound of learning into the street. The children came with different struggles. Some feared failure, some doubted themselves, some simply lacked the encouragement to try. He gave them all the same gift: his time, his patience, and his belief that they could do more than they imagined. The retired engineer began to notice something changing within himself too. The weight of purposelessness that had once pressed against him grew lighter. He felt alive in a way he hadn't since his working years. Not because he was building machines anymore, but because he was helping to build lives. The children's victories became his victories, the first perfect test score, the moment when a shy girl raised her hand confidently in class, the day a struggling boy announced he wanted to be an inventor. Each small success felt like a seed planted in soil he never thought he would till again. The man realized that knowledge was not meant to be stored like blueprints in a drawer. It was meant to be passed on, to move forward through others. He saw the spark in their eyes when a difficult problem suddenly made sense. And in those sparks, he recognized pieces of his own younger self, the dreamer, who once believed anything could be built with enough courage and persistence. What began as a single tutoring session had become something larger. Children filled his evenings, and parents offered gratitude that words could not fully capture. Yet what moved him most was not their thanks, but the way the children began to believe in themselves. He no longer saw only numbers and equations on the page. He saw futures unfolding. And in quiet moments, as the sun set behind the houses, he understood that he was no longer invisible. Through these young hearts and minds, he was leaving something of himself that time could never erase. Years slipped by with a quiet grace, and the small circle of students who once gathered around his porch grew up and moved on. Some pursued engineering, others medicine, teaching, or the arts, but all carried within them the spark he had nurtured. The retired engineer, now older and slower in his steps, would still smile whenever one of his former students stopped by to share their progress. He listened with pride as they spoke of scholarships, inventions, and dreams taking shape. Each story was a reminder that the seeds he planted had taken root far beyond his reach. His home remained modest, the same porch where lessons had once been held, now sitting quietly under the afternoon sun. He no longer needed to prove himself or search for meaning in empty days, because meaning surrounded him. It lived in the young doctor who once struggled with fractions, in the engineer designing bridges who once feared failing math, in the teacher who now shared her own knowledge with a new generation. His legacy was not in trophies or titles, but in the lives touched by his patience and belief. When he eventually passed away, the news rippled through the neighborhood. The porch filled once again, this time with grown men and women who had once been children at his table. They came with flowers, with memories, with stories that spilled from their hearts. One of them, now a respected scientist, spoke quietly before the gathered crowd. He said that the man they all remembered had not only taught them formulas and equations, but had shown them how to believe in themselves, how to look at challenges as puzzles waiting to be solved. His voice broke for a moment, then steadied as he said that everything they had built, every success they had achieved, carried traces of the old engineer's guidance. There was no grand monument, no statue raised in his honor, but in the silence that followed, it was clear that his memory was alive in each of them. His lessons had outlasted him, flowing like an unseen current into the future. As the crowd slowly dispersed, a young boy tugged at his mother's hand, asking who the man was that everyone spoke of with such love. She knelt and told him he was someone who believed that knowledge should never be kept locked away, because knowledge grows when it is shared. The boy nodded, thoughtful, as if storing the idea for later, and in that moment, it was as if the retired engineer still lived on, not just in the minds of those he had taught, but in the promise of every child yet to learn, every dream yet to be built. The story of the retired engineer reminds us that true legacy is not measured by wealth or fame, but by the quiet ways we touch the lives of others. Sharing knowledge is more than teaching facts. It is planting hope, building courage, and shaping futures unseen. Each of us carries wisdom that, when shared, can ripple through generations. Perhaps the greatest measure of a life well lived is not what we keep, but what we give away freely. May this